I see in the conference later there's a session on the GA management protocols for concussion, as well as a wider session on injury. But if I have one objective in advance of those two sessions later, it's maybe to think about this particular injury in a more rounded way. So not solely as a medical issue, obviously that's important, but also to take lessons from other areas, like policy, like law, and I suppose my academic background, which is the social sciences of sport. Because typically, sports medicine doesn't always talk to sports studies, if you like, about how athletes interpret pain and injury. And maybe physiologists don't talk as well as they might with sociologists about the different and competing meanings of health. And that has significant repercussions, I think, for how we understand the challenges associated with concussion. So for that reason, my subtitle is very deliberately provocative. Culture eats protocol for breakfast. And I'll try to say a little bit more about that as we go along. But what I'd like to do this morning is maybe firstly set out some of the ways in which concussion is similar to other injuries, but in many other ways very different. And that's why it warrants very critical attention. Secondly, to spend a little bit more time on that first word there, culture, and on the dynamics within sport, which have not only acted to hide concussion from plain view, as it were, figuratively speaking, but also to produce a set of highly conformist beliefs around risk, which impact on how players and coaches view the injury. And then, having done that, hopefully to reflect a little bit more on the ways in which education around concussion might be reframed. And if I can stick to all of that within a half hour, without speaking like a motor mouth, hopefully we'll have maybe a good 10 minutes for a discussion afterwards. But Martin asked me to say a few things maybe briefly about myself at the beginning, and it might give you a sense of where I'm coming from as coaches and coach educators, because reflection is central to coach education. Taking a step back, taking stock of the factors that influence our practice, and having gained a bit more knowledge and insight, then being better equipped, hopefully better educated and constantly learning. And I certainly am aware that the more I learn about this injury, the more I realise what I don't know. So I work as a senior lecturer at the School of Sport at Ulster University on the Jordanstown campus. I'm sure you'll be familiar with it. And I teach on the master's programme there in sports coaching and performance, supervised doctoral research. Amongst other things, if you're interested, we're currently offering a fully funded opportunity to research concussion at PhD level. So do visit our webpage if you want more information. But you won't be surprised to know that my role would also then involve much more research on all aspects of sport and identity. So I started out studying a little bit more about women's sports. I'm researching national identity, but particularly for today, I'm researching pain, injury and concussion. And that academic career certainly wasn't planned. There was no grand strategy. It actually emerged from my own personal involvement in sport, initially as an All-Ireland schools athlete, and then an elite team sports player. And I benefited from the expansion in women's sports. So, did the expectation to play hurt impact on me? Yes. Did I train and compete when in pain and injury? For sure. And sometimes to the overall detriment of my health. I'd be lying if I denied it. I was the youngest member of the Ladies Gaelic Central Council, an all-star, senior All-Ireland medal winner, and I've also represented Ireland in soccer and rugby. Did I ever exert some, I suppose, degree of agency in challenging the expectation to play hurt? Yes, I did, but with consequences. For me personally and for my career, when I pushed back against those who had the power to impact on my selection. And do I have experience of concussion as a player, a coach, administrator? Yes to all three. So as one example, having coached the winners of the annual British Universities Ladies Gaelic Shield tournament, one of our players was subsequently hospitalised, owing, it transpired, to the failure to declare a prior concussion in another sport, and then experiencing a second one in the tournament from what was a very innocuous tackle in a designated non-contact sport. So that journey has taken me from sporting innocence, I suppose, to scepticism sometimes about the role of sport and its impact. But generally I sit a bit more comfortably, I hope, between a healthy pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. Because the challenges are great when it comes to injury and player welfare. And you'll know this, those of us involved in the management of facilities, the running of sports clubs, the coaching of youths and adults, and the administration of governing bodies, we have a central part to play in establishing a climate of precaution regarding sports-related brain injury in particular. So I said I'd say something about the injury relative to others. Concussion is similar to other injuries in terms of the same social relations. The relations in sport that foster the acceptance and normalisation of injury and the expectation to play on, as well as the burden on medics and healthcare professionals to declare players fit to train, to play, or to return to a game. But crucially, however, it's different because it's potentially life-threatening as a one-off or a recurrent event. And that seriousness means that it's quite rightly more heavily regulated. You'll know probably that developments in NFL in the States and then in rugby union have been mirrored in rugby league and various other football codes around the world, Gaelic football included, and in stick games, field and ice hockey, hurling, camogie and lacrosse, for example. Concussion is also unique in having discrete and lengthy codes of practice and protocols written into the regulations of sports. Loss of consciousness doesn't occur in the majority of cases, and there can be limited perceived impact on performance because it has a complex presentation over a range of domains: balance, memory, cognition, and so on. And of course, there can be delayed and hidden symptoms. And there's the emerging cloud around longer-term harm, including CTE, dementia, and other cognitive impairments that are associated with repeated subconcussive impacts that shake the brain and trigger changes in its morphology. That was the stark warning given to Conor Shanahan recently, the under-20s Roscommon footballer, forced to retire after 6 diagnosed concussions spanning rugby and Gaelic football, 4 of which he experienced before the age of 18. So as a result of the complexities of the injury, the relationship with pain is also less straightforward for concussion compared to others. So let me give you an example. Loss of consciousness can be experienced without pain. Concussion may also mean that an athlete loses the capacity to operate autonomy and decision-making, even if they don't always recognise it. And harder forms of intervention are justified. You'll have seen debates, I'm sure, around the onus of decision-making. Players say that medics have to be the one to decide because they don't want to leave the field of play. Adrenaline kicks in unless they're absolutely forced to do so. And responses from medics to say, well, they don't deal in the science of certainty, especially in light of the ongoing search for the silver bullet of pitch-side diagnosis. And in that kind of example, medics are usually present. But of course, these are the minority when we think of the youths, the adults, men and women who participate weekly in amateur sport, where arguably the greatest risks lie, owing precisely to the absence of medical expertise. So for those reasons, concussion seemingly generates more debate than any of the other sports injuries combined. So let's take a look at the cultural dynamics a little bit more. And despite the growing awareness around the injury, particularly in the last decade or so, driven mainly by the fallout from Bennett O'Malley's post-mortem work in the States on former NFL players, there are many who are informed about concussion, but for various reasons ill-inclined to act. There are others who are informed, but not yet able to recognise the injury. Then there are those who are uninformed, and then others who are actively opposed, some, to preventative action. So even in my own research here, conducted with amateur players across higher and lower divisions, these players had undertaken a governing body concussion awareness programme. And in that study, we found that players had developed a very high tolerance towards pain and injury and an irreverence of sorts to concussion compared to other injuries, which led to a set of self-exempting beliefs about its management. So paradoxically, having completed the awareness programme, they continued to deny its existence in practice. And though we're still learning more about those beliefs, here in Ireland in particular, there is worldwide research on this, and we can apply some of the general findings from elsewhere, I think. And from my perspective today, the most important of these is that culture influences identity. So a personal identity and a group identity. Because in it we have norms, we have language, social values, and a set of social practices that shape how we interact with like-minded people. So culture is the glue that holds all of us together. And from an increasingly young age, we're socialised into the culture of sport in Ireland. Very specifically, a culture that values risks, rewards those who exhibit the right attitude. The players that take one for the team, the player that carries on despite being injured, the player that takes a risk for that big game because the coach or the team need him or her. And being socialised into that culture from a young age leads to a set of self-exempting beliefs that are specific to competitive sport, specifically beliefs around health. So there are those who think they have a personal immunity to health compromises. These are the bulletproofers. It'll never happen to me until that injury happens that forces them to reevaluate. Then there are those who don't believe medical evidence about sports-related injuries, especially the longer-term health effects. You might call them the skeptics, as it were. And then there are those who take the ubiquity of risk to its logical conclusion. Life and sport are a jungle, and the risks are worth it. And such commendations about risk and its value are given to perhaps only one other occupation, the military, who through their ordinary pursuits become injured, maimed, or worse, killed, and go on to be celebrated for their dedication and practice. And that tells you something, I think, of the elevated position of sport in the lives of people around the world and here in Ireland. Sport matters a very great deal as an expression of social and cultural values. It's usually presented as being about opportunity and realising potential, so it's hardly surprising that messages about the culture of risk in sport and of some of these health compromises are less welcome and less popular. Because we invest so much of ourselves in sport and we identify so closely with it, questions regarding these norms around the expectation to play hurt, well, sometimes they're often dismissed as implied criticism. So it's more acceptable then to present the benefits of sports participation, but less so of some of the health compromises. Now, we're not to be blamed for that in many ways, because this rose-tinted perspective emerged hand in hand with modern forms of competitive sport in the early 1900s. And as the competitive ethos has heightened, and we've probably seen a gap emerge between what we might call today high performance and grassroots sports, I think it's important that we're willing to dig beneath the skin of that culture and examine its routines, because it's a culture that's led to concussion being hidden almost, as it were, from plain view since the 1900s. So let me remind you again of the subtitle, Culture Eats Protocol for Breakfast. Originating in the world of management, made famous by President, I think it was Ford Motor Cars, the original phrase referred to strategy, but I've adapted it here. And if I were to put it as simply as I could, concussion protocols, posters, awareness workshops and the like are all, of course, needed and very welcome, but they're more likely than not to have limited impact, especially in amateur sport, unless we first pave the way for change by examining the pre-existing cultural imperatives in sport. And in particular, I'm thinking of the imperative to play through pain and injury, no matter the cost. The imperative to change sporting practice. Where does it come from and why? And the first one concerns me, the imperative to play through pain and injury, because up to now, concussion or sports-related brain injury has been addressed by governing bodies mainly as a medical issue, understandably so. There's been a focus on diagnosis, recovery and management protocols, but it's only half the picture. And a cursory read of any of the systematic reviews around concussion will confirm that there's now concern across most sports. Some sports have higher reported frequency than others, depending on the dynamics and the physical forces, even sometimes playing positions. We know that concussions occur for both sexes, even in those sports with a non-contact designation. And of course, remember that it doesn't have to be caused by a blow to the head. All we need is velocity brain shaking from a collision of sorts. But all of these data need to be read with a little bit of caution as well. Not only because we're constantly learning, but because, well, the data aren't simply a factual representation of prevalence. because we know that there's underreporting of sports injury generally, but particularly in concussion. We also know that emergency department data lack detail, sometimes related to the level of sports competition and maybe even sometimes the sports organisation involved. So there's still an ongoing debate about the prevalence of concussion. Do the figures underestimate the concussion burden? Is the recent evidence of a significant increase more a consequence, perhaps, of the media-driven changes in public perceptions of the injury? Or maybe even of the observer effect, that coaches and players have begun to modify their reporting knowing that they're being monitored. This was certainly noticeable in one injury surveillance study conducted at Ulster University. The science of concussion continues to evolve, and the medicalisation of injury surveillance is a nice case in point. So there's lots of debates around what exactly concerns time loss, what it means to have a reportable medical attention, and even what it means around severity of injury. Now, we don't need to solve that conundrum, and you'll probably be glad to know we don't need to. What matters far more, I would argue, is the beliefs that we hold around pain and injury, and the ways in which these impact on our practice. So what we embody and we seek to embed, individually and collectively within our clubs and nationally, about what constitutes a good team player in Gaelic games. What attributes might a player of either sex exhibit about going that extra mile? What constitutes for coaches a niggle compared to a so-called real injury? Because it's within that context that has long historical roots that the dangers of concussion are realised. And awareness of those dangers isn't new, as I said, either in the general population or within sport. Head injuries have waxed and waned as a sporting and public concern throughout the 20th century. Knowledge about them emerged in the 1800s initially on studies on train injuries and regarding boxing and American football in the 1900s. For instance, the three largest universities in Atlantic City disbanded their football teams for one season in 1897, owing to the furore around the death of a player. But crucially, few have openly acknowledged the similarity in brain trauma between boxing and other sports, such as the various football codes. So 100 years on, or slightly more, these comparisons are now becoming almost unavoidable, owing especially, of course, to tragic deaths, not just of professional or elite players, but of youth players. And it took the formal interjection of the American Medical Association and a campaign to ban boxing in the 1980s before the NFL in the States began to conduct its own investigations. And the ways in which legal cases against the NFL have proceeded so far in a class action settlement totaling $765 million brought the actions of World Rugby authorities under greater focus. So they have now adopted, as you probably will know, a four-pronged risk management approach to concussion. So they're working on law changes, education, management protocols, and of course, ongoing research. Now, I don't have time today to examine all of those in detail, but if you're interested, there's certainly a discussion about them in this forthcoming book, The Business and Culture of Sports. Suffice to say that the justification of the initiatives centres on the acceptance of the need to play hurt and the normalisation of risk. And language too plays an important role in how we view and understand concussion. Denial, masking and controlling pain in front of others, these are well-established features of what we might call sports talk. But it's instructive, for instance, that relative to many other injuries in the sports vernacular, like torn medial ligament, pulled hamstring, broken collarbone and so on, both the noun concussion and the verb concussed hide the location of the injury, the brain. So the language is clouding the injury, and language is part of culture. And the cultural DNA of sport shapes the ways in which athletes understand injury and convey the meanings about it. And their interpretations of injury will stem very understandably from the desire to strive for improved performance and competitive success, and from the commitment they make in identity terms. But the norms around playing hurt become internalised and shared. And it leads to a particularly high tolerance of pain and injury in sport, and a belief, of course, that these are essential components of sporting life, part of the game, as it were. Brain injuries are not only experienced in light of these norms, but they're located at the more conformist end of that spectrum. So studies of concussion among athletes provide very rich evidence of the culture of risk. Players behave with less caution. And there's a particularly marked reluctance to present the symptoms of concussion to medical staff. So concussion is actually one of the more revealing examples of the most problematic forms of behaviour when it comes to sports injuries. So that's why I said at the beginning it was important to understand how it's similar, but also how it's different to many other injuries. Now, the research we've been involved in found that in line with the demands of the sporting culture, Irish amateur rugby players exhibited a notable irreverence towards head injuries. Our study showed that the players managed concussion by downplaying it, ignoring it, denying its significance, concealing the symptoms and playing on. Some of the post-injury consequences like sleep disturbances, mood swings were also largely hidden from teammates and coaches. And part of the underlying logic was the importance of contributing to the team. So rather than defining the injury as serious in terms of being potentially life-threatening, or indeed having long-term consequences for health, players defined the injury in relation to its impact on playing ability. In other words, they adapted their understanding of concussion, even after concussion awareness programs, in line with the expectation of being able to train and play. Their focus was on time loss. And this definition acted to legitimate the denial of the injury and to conceal it more generally. But these players actually went further in two ways, because the relatively limited perceived impact of concussion on their ability to play led to a preference for concussion over other injuries. From their perspective, a brief period of unconsciousness could merely hold up a game, rather than necessitate an individual's withdrawal. So in all cases, withdrawal was the very last option, particularly in this game, given the constraints of team size and the limited number of substitutions that vary across the amateur divisions in rugby. But secondly, some went so far as to rationalise the benefits of concussion, stating that it enabled them to revert to a kind of primal state, which helped them to play below the level of conscious cognition. Now, while such irreverence to head injury might seem more conceivable in professional sports, where we know the mantra is more clearly focused on winning, let me remind you, these are the weekly club players, higher and lower divisions, rural and urban, going about their daily lives, working and studying, most of them, and they demonstrated an unwavering commitment to their local teams. And inconceivable though it might seem, in Gaelic games, we have well-established research now on pain and injury attitudes, and on the risk of burnout, of course. And we've all heard or know of testimonies about the views of players regarding concussion, some in the media, some anecdotally. So here's what some Gaelic players have said. It's like a setback for 3 weeks and then you're back again. Second quote, obviously from a male player, you like to be manly about playing and you'll play at all costs. I'd become wise how to beat the tests. I knew I was concussed, but I wanted to play on. And at club level, it wasn't an issue because there wasn't a lot of medical staff. And of the available research on concussion with senior county players, and this was, I think, a study done by the GPA, over 150 county players, more than half had been concussed while playing. Under half had had multiple concussions, between 2 and 5 on average. More than half had played on, and just under half had returned to play prior to being symptom-free. So Conor Shanahan's recent case isn't an isolated incident, that's for sure. Indeed, it's very revealing, I think, of the silencing cultural effects that when we do hear of concussion, we hear it mainly from former players at the end of their careers who've retired, like Sean Kavanagh, for instance, who spoke recently to RTE of prepping himself for some of the tests by knowing the mathematical scores. Or others like Conor Shanahan, who've been forced to retire owing to repetitive brain injury. At Ulster, we also have even more data yet to be published with other county teams in football and hurling, which shows the very powerful effects and the expectation of wanting to play hurt. To give you just one example, and this is the youngest member of one county team. Here's what she said. Well, as I know scientifically and logically, it's very negative, and she was talking about playing with pain and through injury. You should be looking after your body and health, and you should be taking all the time out. You shouldn't be risking anything that's going to be a threat for you in the future. But here's the critical mismatch. She then went on to say, but as a player, it's good. It makes you a stronger player and better in the future. It sounds so petty, but what doesn't kill you does make you stronger. Now, the search for this almost ultimate sporting hero, it's deeply ingrained in us all, from the habitat and habits of competitive sport. In this pursuit, we rationalise the need to play hurt, we accept risk as normal, we usually avoid a diagnosis of concussion, and success can sometimes be over-evaluated. But we also have a duty to ask how that sporting world is constituted, even if the outcome of the introspection makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. And likewise important would be the ways in which we might encourage players to take sensible risks when representing their clubs and counties, to shift the balance towards a culture of precaution. Now, it's not a task that can be resolved simply or quickly, certainly in light of the historical picture that I've painted to you today. But better context management of risk within each club can assist a growing awareness of the potential harms associated with concussion. It can promote self-withdrawal where needed from the training pitches and from the playing grounds. It can lay open for discussion within teams the narrative which places undue emphasis on being tough and hard. And more than that, probably a likely change in the realisation by sports organisations of their vulnerability to legal challenge will also shift the landscape. Given the legal cases emerging here and in the UK, you might know that former Irish rugby player Killian Willis's case is due to open next month against Sale Sharks. But we can also learn a little bit more from other education programmes in sport. For instance, those in relation to doping, which were less successful, where merely emphasising the fair play ethos didn't always bring about a major change in behaviour. The same component parts, the health risks and the addiction to winning, could also be held to apply to education about concussion, which in its current guise seems to be more of a one-size-fits-all approach. So in terms of the education around concussion moving forward, I think we need to determine a little bit more clearly the attitudes towards concussion on the part of various groups, because not everybody's going to think in the same way. It will differ, and therefore the design and delivery of education programmes will need to be adapted to this. So I'm thinking, for instance, of parents who might have a different knowledge base, say, to teachers or coaches. I'm thinking of players of varying ages and experience. And parents, of course, are critical to this because their consent has been manufactured via the proxy of sports clubs and organisations. And of course, values will differ across different sports. So an education programme, for instance, in relation to rugby union, may not be as effective if it's simply parachuted into a culture in a different sport. We also need to select the target groups a little bit more carefully because there's a need to determine the communication methods that are likely to be most effective. So we have apps, face-to-face workshops, online videos and so on. You'll be aware of these. And all of these, of course, could be combined in different ways, but they need to be guided by a very clear training strategy. Because then the delivery voices could be best suited to different groups. So for example, it may be the case that in certain kinds of education workshops, doctors would be centrally involved. In others, it might be celebrity players. For younger players, it might be more youth role models. And even in other scenarios, it might be external training and development professionals. And I say that because Ulster Rugby have now involved Women's Aid in Belfast for their training and development workshops around sex and sexuality, while other external companies are also employed in similar roles in the UK and here in professional sport. To date, our collective attitude to concussion and CTE hasn't yet represented an attitudinal step change. The self-exempting beliefs I described here continue to act as shields of sort against the reality of harm. Concussion remains mediated by the culture of risk, which has contributed to the silencing of concerns over the health-harming consequences. Now, we shouldn't be too surprised. CTE is itself only diagnosed post-mortem, and associated symptoms become slowly more visible. But the situation could potentially change once biomedical technology has advanced and we're able to render concussion more amenable to visual inspection. Now, that said, we shouldn't have a misplaced faith in the neutrality of medical science, nor of its scope. While none of us, I suppose, has the power individually to change the culture of an entire nation, we can impact on cultural practices within our own immediate sphere of sporting influence. Because within that scope, power does lie with you. As coaches, you can set the tone regarding the norm of playing hurt. You can play a role in the creation of shared values around the meaning of success. And you can model a culture of precaution. As an alternative to ignorance or denial about these issues, even a commitment by you today to think about it further represents a not insignificant step forward. Because in the end, we're stewards today of tomorrow's world, of the sporting futures and brains of our young people. And I, for one, believe that that's a responsibility worth taking very seriously.